The envelope felt lighter than I expected for something designed to destroy a life. My fingers didn't tremble. My breathing stayed even. 200 guests watched me standing at the center of the Fairmont Ballroom in downtown Vancouver, champagne flutes catching the chandelier light, and I simply smiled at my husband across the table and said, "You wanted witnesses." So did I. His name was Richard. Richard Calloway. 14 years ago, he'd walked into the architecture firm where I worked as a junior designer and told me I had the most precise handwriting he'd ever seen on a set of blueprints. He said it like a compliment. It took me years to understand he'd always been more interested in precision than in people. I'm Claire. Claire Calloway, née Marchetti. 41 years old. I grew up in a duplex in East Vancouver, the daughter of a retired school bus driver and a woman who altered wedding dresses out of our basement. We weren't poor exactly, but we understood the difference between wanting something and being allowed to want it. I learned early that certain rooms in this city were not built for people like me. Richard opened those rooms. He was the third-generation managing partner of Calloway Property Group, one of the largest commercial real estate firms in British Columbia. Old money. West Vancouver old money, which is its own particular species. His family had donated a wing to Children's Hospital. His grandfather's name was on a scholarship at UBC. When Richard Calloway attended a charity gala, tables shifted to accommodate him. When I attended, people asked who I came with. I told myself that was fine. I told myself for 14 years that it was fine. That love doesn't require equal footing. That I was building something real. That the way he sometimes corrected my pronunciation in front of colleagues, or steered me away from conversations he deemed above my expertise, or reminded me gently that my instincts about certain clients were charming but not quite right, I told myself that was just Richard being careful. Precise. That was simply how he moved through the world. The first crack I couldn't repair appeared on a Tuesday in January. I'd come home early from a site visit in Burnaby. The ferry crossing had been cancelled due to weather, and everything reshuffled. I walked into our home in Point Grey, a 6-bedroom craftsman that I had renovated almost entirely myself, every tile chosen, every light fixture sourced, and I heard Richard on the phone in his office. The door was half open. I wasn't listening. I was hanging up my coat. But some words carry across rooms whether you're listening or not. She doesn't know anything about the restructure, he said. And she won't. I need you to transfer the second account before the end of the quarter. Claire is still listed as co-signatory on the business account, so it needs to be clean. I stood in my hallway for what felt like a very long time. Then I put my coat back on and went for a drive. I want to be honest about what happened next, because honesty is the thing that ultimately saved me. I didn't confront Richard that evening. I didn't cry. I went to visit my older sister, Inez, who lives in a condo in Kitsilano and has never trusted Richard, not once in 14 years, and has never been diplomatic about saying so. I sat at her kitchen island and told her what I'd heard. Inez put down her tea and said, "Claire, listen to me very carefully. Do not touch anything. Do not move anything. Call David Park tomorrow morning." David Park was her divorce lawyer. I called him the next morning. What followed was 3 months of the quietest, most meticulous work I have ever done in my life. David connected me with a forensic accountant named Susan, who operated out of a modest office on Granville Street and who had the particular gift of making catastrophic financial discoveries sound almost calm. Susan found what I could not have found alone. The second account Richard had mentioned held $2.3 million. It had been incrementally moved over 4 years from accounts that included joint marital assets, money that, under British Columbia's Family Law Act, I was entitled to a portion of. He had structured it through a numbered company registered in Alberta, named after nothing recognizable, designed to look like a routine business holding. It was not a routine business holding. Susan also found the transfers to a property purchased in West Kelowna, under Richard's name alone, bought 8 months ago. A lake house. Richard had told me the firm was looking at commercial opportunities in the Okanagan. I had believed him. I had even suggested some design specifications for a potential client-facing retreat. The lake house had a second bedroom with a woman's reading glasses on the nightstand. Susan's investigator photographed them through the window. "Standard procedure," she said. I almost laughed. I did not tell Richard any of this. I went home every evening. I made dinner twice a week as I always had. I attended the Callaway Property Group's annual fundraiser in February and wore the navy wrap dress Richard had bought me for our 10th anniversary. And I shook hands with people whose names I had spent years memorizing, and I smiled in photographs. And I drove home in the passenger seat of Richard's Audi while he talked about a development project in Surrey, and I nodded. And I said the right things. The invitation to the anniversary gala came from Richard himself in early March. "I want to do something significant this year," he told me over breakfast. 14 years. The Fairmont. Proper celebration. I looked at him across the kitchen table. "I'd love that," I said. And I would have, once. I genuinely would have. He handled everything. The venue, the florist, the catering. He told me he wanted to surprise me with the details. He asked for the guest list of people I cared about, which I thought was tender of him, and I gave it to him, and he added his own people, 200 total, and confirmed it all without my involvement. David called me the following week. "He's filed," he said. "The papers were drawn up 3 weeks ago. Richard has retained Morrison and Bright." He paused. "That's Callaway's firm. They've handled his family's interests for 30 years. I sat very still. "He's planning to serve you," David continued. "Somewhere public, we think. A moment where you'll be too shocked to respond clearly. Somewhere that reinforces his version of events before you've had time to establish yours. A charity gala. A celebration. 200 witnesses to my humiliation, every one of them from his world, his network, his narrative." I thought about the lake house in West Kelowna. I thought about my mother in that basement, pinning seams on other women's wedding dresses. I thought about 14 years of learning to want the right things in the right rooms. "All right," I said. "Let's talk about what I'm going to do." There was one person I needed to speak with first, and she was the reason I hesitated longest. Richard's mother, Margaret Callaway, was 73 years old and had been widowed for 6 years. She was a slight woman with extraordinary posture and silver hair she wore pinned at the nape of her neck, and she had been, from the very beginning, something I had not expected. Genuinely kind to me. Not performatively kind, not the obligatory warmth of a society woman welcoming the inconvenient daughter-in-law. Actually kind. She remembered the names of my parents. She asked about Inez. When Richard and I renovated the Point Grey house, she came to see it and said, standing in the kitchen I had designed from nothing, "You have real vision, Claire. This room is better than anything Richard could have imagined on his own." I had loved her for that. What I discovered, through Susan's investigator, was something Margaret did not know I knew. And what I had to decide was whether I had the right to use it. The investigator had found the documents in the course of mapping Richard's asset history. A letter, dated 1987, written by Margaret to a man named Gerald Forsyth, a former business associate of Richard's father, William Callaway, who had left Vancouver abruptly when Richard was 8 years old, and never re-established contact with the family. The letter was in a file that Margaret herself had apparently provided years ago to the family's estate lawyer, as part of a broader document review when William's will was settled. It had been filed and forgotten. Gerald Forsyth was Richard's biological father. Margaret had been 29. The marriage to William had been difficult. Gerald had been warm in a way William was not. She had ended it herself. She had told William nothing. She had raised Richard as a Callaway, because Richard was a Callaway in every way that she believed mattered, and perhaps she was right. Perhaps she was. But under British Columbia law, and under the terms of William Callaway's estate, which was the foundation of the inheritance Richard had used for the last 6 years, including to fund the accounts he'd hidden from me, the entitlement was contingent on lineage that, technically, did not exist. I sat with this for a long time. I called Inez. She said, "Claire, that man has been quietly taking from you for 4 years. You didn't do this to Margaret." He did. I thought about my mother's basement. About precision and people. I called Margaret directly. We met for tea at a cafe near her condo in West Vancouver. I brought nothing. I simply sat across from her and told her the truth, what I had found, what Richard was planning, and what I knew about Gerald Forsyth. She was very still for a very long moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, I said. "And you came to me first?" "Yes." She looked out the window at the street. A transit bus went by. Someone was walking a golden retriever. Margaret watched all of this. "He was never supposed to know," she said finally. William was a hard man. Gerald was, it doesn't matter what Gerald was. I made choices. I protected my son. I know, I said. You're not here to ask my permission. No, I said. I'm here because you deserve to decide how you want to be in the room when it happens. She looked at me then, and I saw something in her face that I recognized, the expression of a woman who has been managing consequences for so long that the original choice has almost disappeared beneath them. What do you need from me? She asked. I told her. The night of the gala, I wore a deep green wrap dress I'd bought myself at a boutique on South Granville. I did my own hair. I drove myself to the Fairmont. Richard greeted me at the entrance with his hand at the small of my back and his best public smile, the one he used for investors and journalists, and I smiled back at him and said, "This is beautiful. You did all of this. For you," he said. The ballroom was extraordinary. White flowers everywhere, peonies, which he knew I loved. String quartet in the corner. 100 circular tables with candles burning. He had done this beautifully, and the cruelty of that was not lost on me. Even the ambush was elegant. We moved through the room. I spoke to people I recognized, people I'd spent years building careful relationships with. His colleagues, their spouses, a few of my own friends from the architecture world who'd been included on my guest list and who did not yet know what they were about to witness. Richard was charming and attentive and kept his hand at my back. And I let him, because I have learned that the most powerful position in any room is the one no one thinks to watch. Margaret arrived at 7:45. She wore a gray silk jacket and carried a small ivory clutch. She found my eyes across the room and held them for just a moment. I nodded. Richard moved us toward the center of the room just after 8. A microphone. His business partner, Gordon Shan, had said a few words. Champagne had been poured. Richard had given a gracious speech about marriage, about partnership, about the 14 years we'd built together, and I stood beside him and held my glass and thought about a duplex in East Vancouver and a woman pinning seams in a basement. Then, he reached into his jacket. I also have something I've been meaning to give you, he said. He was looking at me, but he was speaking to the room. He held out the envelope. And I, having rehearsed this with David, having rehearsed it alone in my kitchen at midnight, having rehearsed it in my car on the way here, I looked at the envelope, and I looked at Richard, and I said, quite clearly, so that the people nearest us could hear, "Before I open that, I'd like to give you something first." He didn't move. I turned to the room. "Margaret," I said. "Would you come up here?" There was a small ripple of movement. Margaret came forward from where she'd positioned herself near the side of the room, as we'd arranged, and when she reached us, I handed her the small silk bag I'd carried all evening in my own clutch. She accepted it with both hands. Richard was watching his mother. "What is this?" he said. Not to me, to her. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. Whatever she felt in that moment, grief, guilt, love, all three together, she kept it inside herself with the composure of a woman who has held things inside for a very long time. "You should open it," I said to her gently. "The documents on top are mine. But what's underneath belongs to your family." Margaret reached into the bag. The first set of documents was Susan's financial report. Summarized, flagged, annotated. The numbered company. The West Kelowna property. The $2.3 million. 14 pages. I had made copies for David, for the court filing that had already been submitted that morning, and for Gordon Sean, who received his copy by email at 7:58 p.m. and who was, at this moment, standing very still at the edge of the room reading his phone. The second document was a letter. It was not the original that was held securely with my lawyer, but a clear reproduction of Margaret's handwriting, dated 1987, addressed to Gerald Forsyth. Margaret held it. She did not read it aloud. She had not agreed to read it aloud, and I had not asked her to. What she did was look at Richard, and in that look was 35 years of a secret that had shaped everything. His confidence, his inheritance, his name, his sense of belonging to something that predated him and would outlast him. "Mom," Richard said. His voice was different. "What is that?" "Something I should have told you differently," she said. "And something your wife found because you gave her reason to look very carefully at everything." The room was not silent. There was still music, still the low sound of 200 people breathing and shifting. But the circle immediately around us had gone quiet in the particular way that happens when people understand they are witnessing something they will talk about for years. Richard turned to me. I looked at him calmly. You wanted an audience, I said. I just made sure they had enough information to understand what they were watching. He opened his mouth. The filing was submitted this morning, I said. David Park has the full asset report. Gordon has a copy. The Family Law Act is fairly clear on the treatment of concealed marital property, and Susan was very thorough. He looked at his mother. Then at Gordon, who had put his phone in his pocket and was not walking toward us. Then at the envelope still in his own hand, the divorce papers, the ambush, the elegant cruelty he had planned so carefully. He set the envelope on the table. He didn't leave immediately. That surprised me, actually. Richard had always had an extraordinary sense of self-preservation, and I had expected him to retreat. Instead, he stood there for a moment, and I saw something cross his face that I hadn't seen in many years, something young and undefended. He looked at his mother and said, very quietly, "Is it true?" Margaret said, "Yes." He nodded once, the way he nodded when he received information he needed to process. Then he picked up a champagne flute, drank what remained in it, set it down, and walked out of the Fairmont ballroom. Margaret and I stood together in the aftermath. Someone from the string quartet had stopped playing. Gordon was speaking quietly to one of the partners near the far wall. Around us, 200 people were doing what people at events like this always do when something real has happened. They were performing normalcy while watching us from the corners of their eyes. Margaret took my hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "For all of it." "You don't need to be," I said. And I meant it. You didn't hide money from me. You didn't plan an ambush. I looked at our joined hands, hers, with the simple gold band she still wore for William Calloway, and mine, bare now. The ring removed that morning and left on the kitchen counter of the Point Grey house I would fight to keep. "You came tonight when I asked you to." "Of course I did," she said. "You came to me first." The settlement took 8 months. British Columbia family law does not move quickly, but it moves, and Susan's documentation was ironclad. The West Kelowna property was included in the marital asset calculation. The numbered company's holdings were deemed to have drawn from joint assets and were treated accordingly. I received enough to purchase a smaller house in Mount Pleasant on my own, start the independent design practice I'd shelved when Richard suggested, gently, 6 years ago, that it might conflict with Calloway's client relationships, and take Inez to Portugal for 2 weeks in the autumn. The question of Richard's inheritance was a separate matter, entirely a private family legal process that I had no standing in and did not follow closely. I know only that Gordon Shan assumed full managing partnership of Calloway Property Group by the following spring. The lake house in West Kelowna, I was told by someone who had no reason to lie, was sold. My new house has a south-facing kitchen I designed from scratch and a spare room with good light that I am slowly turning into a studio. In the mornings I walk to a cafe on Main Street where nobody knows my married name, and I drink my coffee, and I work on the drawings that are becoming something I'm genuinely proud of. Inez calls on Sundays. She has started, in the past few months, saying simply "How's the work?" instead of "How are you holding up?" I understand the difference. It means she can see that I'm all right. Margaret calls too. Less frequently, but she calls. We don't discuss Richard, or Gerald Forsyth, or the Fairmont, or any of it. She asks about the studio. She asked if she could see the plans when they're further along. I said she could. Last month, a new client came to my studio for an initial consultation, a woman about my age, referred by a former colleague. She was redesigning a home she'd recently purchased on her own for the first time and wanted something that felt, she said, like it was actually hers. Not a compromise. Not designed around someone else's preferences. Something that began and ended with what she needed. I know that feeling precisely. I opened my sketchbook and said, "Tell me what the room has to do for you. Not what it has to look like. What it has to do." She leaned forward. We were there for 3 hours.